Today is the first day of summer and it's Father's Day. So I'm thinking about my father and my grandfathers, myself and my children and maybe someday grandchildren. Today's also the kickoff service for our summer lay-led series titled Building a New Way, the title of which the worship team chose back in March when the brokenness of the old way was not nearly as evident as it is today. It's been quite a ride this spring, hasn't it? The last 3.5 years, and the last 3.5 months, and the last 3.5 weeks have all made it undeniably clear that building a new way is now urgent. Maybe by the time you see this, we can add 3.5 days or even 3.5 hours to the list of clarifying events. As unsettled as things are, I don't know how building a new way is going to play out in the wider world. But I do know something about building in general, thanks to my father and my grandfathers. My mother's father was a self-trained engineer and served as the chief engineer on the dredge that built Tangier Island in the Chesapeake Bay. He also built industrial power systems all over the northeastern United States. One time he asked me if I knew how a rotary dial telephone works, and when I said, not exactly, he said, "Johnny, I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I didn't understand how that thing works." From him I learned that every system can be understood with curiosity and persistence. He and Grandma raised their daughters in an abandoned cider mill and restaurant, which he slowly converted to a comfortable home. They were do-it-yourselfers before that term even existed. He also taught me all the awful epithets for various races and ethnicities, not because he thought I should know them, but because that was just the language he used all the time. My father's father, an electrical engineer, supervised the first installation of telephone trunk lines in New York City. During the Depression, he supervised pulling them all out again for scrap copper. Then he put them back in again, all for the New York Bell Telephone Company, where he worked his entire career. He was drafted during World War II, but he didn't go because the company threatened the draft board that if their last engineer, my grandfather, went off to war, they would have to shut down all the phone service in New York City. From my father's father, I learned the value of consistent, methodical effort. He also valued tradition for tradition's sake and opposed me changing my name when Ann and I married. I changed it anyway. He unintentionally taught me that some traditions aren't worth keeping. My own father is an interdisciplinary engineer. He was the project manager for the blood chemistry analyzer in the International Space Station, and he designed high-speed photo printing machines for Kodak much of his career. He's also an avid do-it-yourselfer. My dad built a 2-story solar heat collector on the south side of the old farmhouse that he and my mom had completely stripped and remodeled, starting when I was about 10. None of that work was hired. We all pitched in. My parents back then were inspired by the Whole Earth catalog. They bought wheat in 100-pound sacks, ground their own flour and peanut butter, made bread and yogurt. We all chopped firewood and raised chickens, and on and on. I was the only kid in the cafeteria with homemade brown whole wheat bread, and I was so jealous of those soft white bread PB&Js. My dad also did all the repairs on our cars and appliances. This week, at the age of 83, he is laying 60-pound paving stones, 250 of them, on the new patio he's building for himself, right now as I speak. My dad taught me that anyone can build or fix anything once they understand the principles involved. He's also spent much of his adult life preparing for global disruptions, an obsession that has made me kind of impatient with him until this year. So when I was a young father and Ann and I realized that our hippie bus wasn't going to work for our growing family, we bought an old barn in rural Ohio and spent the next 13 years slowly converting it to a comfortable home. The best part is that our kids can actually say, "Why, yes, I was raised in a barn." When we started, that barn still had manure in it. We did almost all the work ourselves, from heavy lifting to the painting, and we literally cooked on a camp stove and slept on the floor for years on end. That building still, to this day, has no shower, and a cattle trough serves as the bathtub. We were about half done when we moved here to Harrisburg, and the half that we built is truly beautiful. Now our son has taken it on, and of course it will be different than what we envisioned, because he's doing that. The thing about a barn conversion is that your vision for it is limited by what's already there, and what's already there is never ideal. Barns and old houses are rarely square or plumb. One time I had to cut 3 sides off a piece of drywall because all 4 corners of the space it was going in were different angles. But the advantage of a conversion is that you can live in it while you build. Building on bare ground is easier, but you can't live in it while you work on it. I think building a new way for our society and for our planet is now urgent, and I see 3 choices. We can convert this manure-stained barn of a society into a welcoming, inclusive, sustainable home. We can burn it down and start over with bare ground. We can do nothing and watch it collapse on its own rotten foundations. You know there are people out there right now actively trying to do each of those 3 options. But it's our children and our grandchildren who will inherit the project or the mess. Another thing about building on bare ground is that besides not being able to live in it, you have to have abundant resources off-site. And when it's a global society you're building, there is no off-site. You have to live there while you build a new one. Burning it down or watching it collapse would bequeath to our children and grandchildren a real mess and no roof to live under while they rebuild. That's called a failed state or a dark age. It's not an attractive option. I don't have grandchildren yet, but I can already feel how much I'm going to love them. I've been watching you other grandparents in this congregation and the other communities I participate in, and I've observed that it seems to me that the love of grandparents for their grandchildren is even richer and deeper than that of parents for their children. Grandparents, raise your hand if I'm onto something here. Yeah, that's what I thought. So if love for our grandchildren exceeds love for our children, and it continues increasing like that, just imagine how I might feel about the 7th generation of my grandchildren if I could be around long enough to actually meet them. So what do I want for those kids I already love but might never meet? Well, I want them to live in a diverse community that loves them. I want them to be adept at resolving conflicts without avoiding conflicts. I'd like if they were able to travel if they want to live within their means, sustainably, without borrowing from their descendants as we do. I'd like it if they can lead happy, simple lives, not stressful rat race ones. I'd love it if they continued the global scientific endeavor with some pride. I hope they know about and honor people on other continents who might seem very different to them. I hope they have time to pursue creative endeavors. How do we build that? How do we convert this old barn to that? Well, a society is much harder to understand than a rotary dial telephone. And trying to understand it is keeping a lot of us up at night now as the foundations of our society begin to crack ominously. I'm thinking about my dad's lesson that anyone can fix anything if they understand the principles involved. What principles make up those foundations that are cracking? Well, there are a lot of them, but I want to lift up just 4 that seem particularly problematic right now. Individualism, the notion that individuals can live independent of society, that they make their own fortunes without contributions from others. Consumerism, the belief that possessions are fulfilling and that wealth involves acquiring goods and services for oneself. Dominion, the belief that the world exists for us to use and abuse as we wish. Supremacy, the idea that some people are more deserving than others to be comfortable and to have their needs and wants met. It's not just white supremacy. Every American citizen benefits from a system that extracts materials and labor from colonized people and lands all over the world. Did you know that Ann and I, with our measly school teacher salaries, are in the global 1% by income, earning 20 times the median? I'm pretty sure there are lots of households in this congregation who make more than Ann and I do. So, welcome to the 1%. In this country, we waste 40% of our food supply. 40 million tons of perfectly good food goes into landfills each year in the United States. That's 219 pounds per person. If you've seen The Story of Stuff, you know that our consumerist economy requires a quick trip from the store to the landfill for consumer goods like toys and electronics. It is insane to think that anyone has ever pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. And yet, I act like I did every time I go all hesitant about reparations or assert my ownership of land here in North America. It is insane to think that we can have unending consumer growth on a finite planet. And yet, I act like we can every time I book a flight, buy a new phone, eat factory farmed meat, or switch on the air conditioning. It is insane to think that my safety is somehow disconnected from your safety, and yet I too was hesitant about attending church in Allison Hill at first. I've also been too polite to call out friends who refuse to wear a mask in crowded places the last few weeks. It is insane to think that my lifestyle, which was built on those principles, is somehow separate from environmental policies, policing policies, global politics, and the destruction of the earth. Every time I act in accord with those principles, it is my knee pressing on the world's neck, and the planet and its people struggle to say, I can't breathe. Any system can be understood with curiosity and persistence. Some traditions aren't worth keeping. Anyone can fix anything if they understand the principles involved. Fixing our broken society means replacing those rotten principles with more durable ones, but that almost certainly involves some discomfort for people like me. Probably for you too. Am I ready to be uncomfortable? Am I willing to live in a building under construction, to make the sacrifices, to do the heavy lifting of building a new way? Our democracy is crumbling around us, but this is no time for righteous indignation, the police this, or the corporations that, or what's the president done now? No. It's time to acknowledge that it is my lifestyle, my entitlement, my consumerism, my white privilege that drives the system. And that system is the knee squeezing the life out of the world. It's not the president's fault I consume 20 times my share of the global pie. It's not Amazon's fault that I keep giving them money. It's not the police's fault that people like me call 911 on suspicious-looking people, or that people like me are somehow never suspicious-looking. But this is also no time for guilty sulking, for feeling ashamed of myself, giving up, or giving away all the resources I currently control. This is a time for humbly but actively using my resources, my time, talent, and treasure, to the best of my privileged ability for the common good. To get myself off the neck of my human siblings and my non-human neighbors, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because I need them to thrive so that my children and grandchildren can too. To do that, I must stop consuming 20 times my share. And I've got to stop acting like I deserve full-time comfort. It's time for me and my fellow Americans, especially white ones, to be less fragile and more resilient. Ann and I have barely begun that process. Our electricity is from 100% renewable sources, but we still heat with gas. We are slowly replacing our cars and gas-powered tools with electric ones when we replace them at all. But we still mow most of our yard, and I still don't know why. My reading list is strong on writers of color and progressive thinkers, but I'm slow to change my behavior. We hang dry most of our laundry, and I grumble the whole time about it. We are shifting to local sources of produce and meat, but we're still eating a fair amount of meat. We mostly do night cooling in the summer, but still run the AC some nights in August, when we could just be hot, like most of the people who live on this world. Baby steps may no longer be good enough. That word principles is familiar to UUs. The 7 principles of the UUA are quite a contrast to the principles I mentioned earlier, and they would make a pretty good blueprint for building a new way, whether it's a barn conversion or a bulldoze job. Am I ready to live them as well as espouse them? Well, let's see. The inherent worth and dignity of every person, that's easier said than done. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, long way to go there. Acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, hard but doable. Free and responsible search for truth and meaning, check. Not perfectly, but we're on the way, I think. The right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. Well, we're getting there, but there's some big, big challenges, especially now. The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Oh my. Respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part? Not a chance. I've barely begun. All of these are easier said than done. Notice there's nothing in there about freedom from discomfort, nothing about preserving my standard of living, nothing about high-speed broadband, not even much about politics. Sure, they all have political implications, but they're mostly about how I approach my relationships with you and with the world outside, the larger world. And these principles, the UUA principles, are hardcore when you come right down to it. I mean, the inherent dignity of that smelly drunk guy with his hand out down by the bus station? Really? Yes, really. How do we do that? It won't be comfortable. Once Ann and I had developed a vision for the barn, for where we wanted walls and windows and floors, then we knew what to cut away from the existing structure. I think many of us are approaching it backwards. We can see what we want to cut out, but we're not as good at seeing what to replace it with, which comes first. And that visioning process is not inherently political. It's personal. It starts in our own hearts and minds. What do we want for the grandchildren? Not our grandchildren, the grandchildren, all of them. Are we living and learning and shopping in a manner that will create that? I think we could do a lot worse than to be guided by a bumper sticker, that one that goes, "Live simply, that others may simply live." We Americans aren't doing that. Not like we could. From those to whom much is given, much is expected. The hard truth is, it wasn't given, it was taken, and it's still being taken to meet our demands. It's time to expect much of ourselves. We can do this. We are teachable and resilient, and we have the benefit of immense resources. Any system can be understood with curiosity and persistence. Some traditions aren't worth keeping. Anything can be built or fixed if we understand the principles involved, even the human heart, even mine. To quote Bob the Builder, yes, we can. So on this Father's Day, the first day of summer, let's gather up some tools and let's get uncomfortable. Do it for the grandchildren. Can I get an amen? Amen. Take a minute right now to reflect and write down at least 3 things you can do today, this week, to reduce your knee print on the world and its people. Maybe brainstorm 10 and then pick a few to actually do. If it involves collaborating with people who look or sound different from you, extra points. Big or small, doesn't matter. What matters is picking up some tools and getting it done. Pause the video if you need more time. You ready? And go. May this first day of summer be a day of construction, building a new way of being in the world, and let it begin with me.